It's only been a year since Valve's Steam Deck made its debut, and its impact can't be understated. Previously limited to bedroom, study or office, PC gaming can now be taken anywhere really, and that's a pretty powerful proposition. Windows-based alternatives have followed, and this one may well be the most exciting of all. The Asus ROG Ally sees a premium brand enter a market that essentially consists of the deck and a range of Chinese-built Windows machines. The Ally is different though, a cut above in many respects, you might say. I'll try to keep this video short so we can get onto the performance and the games experience as quickly as we can, but there's a lot to discuss first. First impressions when you unbox, pretty Spartan actually. Inside the box is the machine itself, power supply and power cable, and that's pretty much it. The power supply delivers 65 watts, enough to power the machine in its full-on turbo mode, with juice to spare in charging the 40 watt-hour battery. Form factor of the machine is also compelling. Significantly smaller than Steam Deck, more than this footage may suggest actually, but still ergonomically sound with textured grips, reassuringly clicky shoulder buttons, analog triggers, plus additional buttons on the rear. Haptics aren't bad either, but still a little buzzy compared to Steam Deck's more nuanced effect. Best of all, at 608 grams, the ROG Ally is very, very light indeed. So, I've seen some reports about issues with the face buttons and the triggers. There have been some complaints about the face buttons sticking and not having much travel. Having spent a couple of weeks with the device, I've not had any of the same issues with the face buttons. They seem okay, not exceptional but fine. In terms of the triggers, they've been okay for me too, for the most part. However, it has not been a completely trouble-free experience. In A Plague Tale Requiem, for example, I found it impossible to use Amicia's sling, making progress through the game impossible without switching to an external controller. So I think there's still a fair amount of bugs and issues that need to be resolved with the Ally's software and perhaps the firmware. I/O on the device is fairly limited, and it's all at the top of the unit. Power button, volume buttons, USB-C, then a PCIe extender port for external GPUs, or rather Asus's brand of Mobile XG GPUs, going all the way up to the Mobile RTX 1490. Rounding off the I/O, you get a micro SD slot and a 3.5mm stereo jack for headsets. Now, you're going to be hearing a lot about the Ally's cooler design, twin fans, zero gravity thermal system, fluid dynamic bearings, 0.1mm ultra thin fans. But the reality is this is the quietest gaming PC handheld I've ever tested. More switch than Steam Deck on its 15 watt performance mode and even its 25 watt turbo mode. Very, very quiet. The fans only really kick in hard on the 30 watt mains turbo mode, but even then it's still relatively quiet overall. This is all the more surprising because those wattage figures only cover the SoC. Total system power draw can range from sort of 22 to 26 watts in performance mode, anything from 40 to 48 watts in mobile turbo mode. It can go higher, it can go lower depending on load, but yeah, 45 watts, 40 watt-hour battery. I'm sure a lot of you out there are already doing the maths, right? The other standout element of the Ally is its screen. 1080p resolution, 120Hz refresh rate, VRR capable. And VRR is kind of a game changer for this market. You can dial in the frame rate limit you want and then tweak settings so deviations below that to a reasonable extent are smoothed away by the variable refresh. The one caveat to say is that VRR is not a cure-all. You will need to tweak your game to operate in a frame rate range where VRR looks good. I also found that stuttering games, whether it's down to the Ally or the game code itself, won't be cured by VRR. Oh, and a Columbo style, just one more thing. Looks to me like VRR is completely disabled if you switch to the display's 60Hz mode, so don't do that. The good news is that VRR still works if you drop down to 720p resolution though. VRR range seems to be in the region of 48 to 120 Hz, but there does seem to be low frame rate compensation down to 30 FPS. Now let's talk about the software, because a vanilla Windows experience with a handheld has proven to be pretty gruesome. I'm pretty sure we'll see a burgeoning range of mobile tools from enthusiasts that expand and improve to cover the Ally, but right now it's all about the Armoury crate, which on its front page is essentially a pretty vanilla launcher. Scans your hardware and gives you access to your games, whether they're from the Xbox Store, Steam, EGX, or whatever. The settings menu allows you to configure control modes to play your games how you want them, plus here is where you set up Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, RGB lighting, and it's also where you edit the command center, which we'll discuss momentarily. The game visual menu tweaks the display to match how Asus thinks specific gaming genres will present themselves most effectively on this specific screen, but more interesting is the operating mode. Now, you can let Windows take care of power management, which probably is not a very good idea, or you can use one of the available presets that Asus provide, Silent, Performance, or Turbo, or you can make up your own preset. Here's a table of those presets courtesy of Asus. Silent mode targets 9 watts and is best reserved for your very low power games. I found pretty much any modern 3D game to turn into a slideshow here. The Z1 Extreme processor is starved of power. Performance mode targets 15 watts, but general operating power draw across the system in a AAA game, as I've mentioned, ranges from about 22 to 30 watts when frame rates are unlocked. Turbo mode changes according to whether you have the power adapter plugged in or not. Turbo on battery targets 25 watts, but full system draw, again, as I mentioned earlier, can hit 44, even 48 watts in some scenarios, and that is pretty extreme. Turbo mode plugged in pushes to an alleged 30 watts, and I saw the processor hit 95 Celsius under load here, so you may well be losing some performance as it hits thermal limits. These 15, 25 and 30 watt limits do seem to be pretty fluid. I suspect that the Ally boosts beyond those limits significantly in some scenarios, especially in portable turbo mode. You can also define your own power limits too, which I suspect a lot of users may be experimenting with in order to get a better balance between performance and battery life, which is at a premium on the ROG Ally. Going back to the Armoury crate, System Stats gives you some numbers to look at, but here's something more interesting in the Content tab. Here you can access media, install different game platforms, look for system updates, it's all here. There's also an area for getting a deep breakdown on your system components, but I think there's a mistake here as we have 6400 megatransfers per second LPDDR5 here, not HBM3. Command Center next, which you can bring up at any time via its own button. This is where you can switch between your power profiles, controller configurations, summon a keyboard and change resolution and refresh rate of the display. The display, not the game. The real-time monitor option is pretty decent actually. You can measure CPU and GPU clocks, monitor SoC temperature and keep an eye on power draw and kind of extrapolate out battery life from there. There's also a frame rate limiter here, but it doesn't seem to function in every game, which is a bug that needs to be addressed. Even so, I think it's not granular enough. So for example, there's no 40 FPS limit there for starters. Let's check out system specs now, and it's here where we are going to see some big advances over Steam Deck. You'll note I've also included AMD's prior mobile flagship, the Ryzen 7 6800U, as a bunch of handhelds like the Neo 2 I reviewed a while back now use this chip. Looking at the CPU side, we have twice as many cores and threads as the Steam Deck's processor, more cache, faster clocks, the whole shooting match really. We're even on a new Zen 4 architecture, which should be significantly ahead of the Zen 2 in the Steam Deck. Clearly there's more commonality between the 6800U and the Z1, though even there we've got a later CPU architecture with the Ally. GPU-wise, the RDNA2 architecture of the DEX Van Gogh processor, and indeed the 6800U, gives way to RDNA3, 12 compute units here, a match in that respect for the 6800U, but 50% more than the 8 CUs in the Steam Deck. Again, more commonality with the 6800U, but I'd hope to see those RDNA3 architectural improvements shine through. Memory bandwidth, we're getting 16 gigs of LPDDR5 here at 6400 megatransfers per second, as I just mentioned, typically what the 6800U came with as well, and faster than the 5500 megatransfers per second LPDDR5 in the deck, all of which sets the stage for some actual testing then, so let's get down to it. So claims have emerged that the Asus ROG Ally at 30 odd watts doubles Steam Deck performance, while you're looking at an extra 50% boost at the same 15 watts. This seems eminently plausible, bearing in mind we've moved on from RDNA2 to RDNA3, Zen 2 to Zen 4, and that the 7nm fabrication process for the Steam Deck APU gives way to the 4nm technology in the Z1 Extreme chip. So there's a lot to unpack and process here, and I think we should try to get in some Ryzen 7 6800U benches in there too at some point, as that chip is far closer to the Z1 in key respects compared to the DEC's custom processor, as we've already seen. This may give us more of an insight into the architectural and process improvements, gen on gen. Top line though, the Z1 is like an iteratively faster version of the 6800U in gaming terms, and while there are some very impressive gains over Steam Deck, the initial claims don't seem to pan out in gaming scenarios. Going to start with a bunch of benchmarks at 720p on settings I think are appropriate to the handheld technology. You'll be familiar with many of them if you've watched my ANEO2 review. Steam Deck is the primary comparison point, but later on we'll be looking at the Ryzen 7 6800U at matching power levels, or at least what we're led to believe are matching power levels. Our first comparison point is Remedy's control at 720p low settings, kind of equivalent to Xbox One barring one or two settings. The game still looks fantastic here, and across the run, the Ally at 15 watts delivers a 20% lead over Steam Deck. Obviously that's not 50% right, but it's a good start. Switching to handheld turbo mode increases frame rate by 28% over the 15 watt mode, which is in turn a 55 percentage point boost against Steam Deck. Plugging in for maximum turbo didn't seem to do much at all, apart from reduce 1% lows, but average frame rates remained the same. Performance numbers pretty impressive though, right? So let's look at 1080p. 15 watt Deck versus 15 watt Ally sees the performance advantage drop back to 11%, while handheld turbo mode offers up a 47 percentage point lead, rising to 53% at full mains turbo. So based on this first benchmark, it seems that gains against Steam Deck in what purports to be a matching 15 watt mode can vary according to resolution, but in no way are we getting that 50 percentage point boost, nor are we getting a doubling of performance with the device fully maxed. Cyberpunk 2077 on Steam Deck preset here, though I've disabled all forms of upscaling. So we're looking at native rendering resolution. But really, please use FSR2 on this one. This is a really heavy game, and the Steam Deck setting surprisingly taxing. Still, the average frame rate numbers look okay. Steam Deck's at 29 FPS for example, but the Ally at 15 watts is up only by around 7%. The issue here is that the Ally stutters more often than the Deck. It's a less consistent experience in this benchmark, and that's actually cause for concern, as I've noticed this kind of hitching during gameplay in titles that do not usually exhibit stuttering issues. Seems to me that the higher power modes are where the Ally is more comfortable. 49% faster than Deck in handheld turbo mode, rising to 58% when in turbo mains configuration. 1080p, not playable obviously when frame rates are so low, but across the board the Ally is benching far lower than it should be. Kinda curious. Forza Horizon 5 next with high settings and TAA, and yeah, this is another title where I've noticed stutter both in the benchmark and in gameplay, but the benchmarks are certainly a good deal better than the Deck. The Ally in 15 watt performance mode has a 29 percentage point advantage over Steam Deck at 720p, but I noticed little difference between the turbo portable and turbo mains outputs, apart from less stutter when plugged in again. Turbo mode is 28% faster than performance mode, with the lead extending up to 66% up against the Steam Deck. That's a healthy chunk of extra performance then. Plugged in 30 watt turbo mode, not really worth bothering with to be honest, just a couple of points more in performance terms. Native 1080p is perfectly doable as well. The ROG Ally in 15 watt performance mode beats the Deck by 34% in its matching 15 watt mode. But this time the two turbo modes offer up very different results. 63% faster than the Valve machine in portable mode, rising to an impressive 70% when plugged in, and this is the closest I've seen in terms of the Z1 delivering on that 2x Deck performance claim. By the way, I'm running with TAA in this benchmark, as Asus says that MSAA support needs optimization on the ROG Ally. However, in my tests on this title at least, it seemed to be running okay, and I'd prefer MSAA on this game. After all, it's kind of what it was designed for in terms of the game's visual aesthetic. Even the base Xbox One has 4x MSAA. Now this is the first you'll see of God of War in our review, and this is a DX11 title where historically AMD's Windows driver has been somewhat weak, and that might explain why the Ally only runs 13% faster in its equivalent performance mode. Balance is returned to the force in the higher power modes, 41 points to the better against deck in the portable turbo mode, rising to 45% when plugged in. There are also strong gains at 1080p too. Here the Ally in performance mode beats the deck in the 15-watt shootout by around 26%. A stronger result than 720p, perhaps because the balance between driver and rendering shifts more towards the latter at higher resolutions. That translates into bigger gains once the turbo modes kick in. So yeah, 55% faster in turbo handheld mode versus the deck, rising to 62.5% at the mains. So at this point we've established that in the all-important 15-watt head-to-head with Steam Deck there can be substantial gains, but also increases can be less impressive too. Fundamentally, good hardware needs to be backed by good software. For our final three benchmarks, we're going to push out the boat on titles where Steam Deck struggles or doesn't function at all, to see what kind of gains we get from the more powerful processor. Let's begin with Returnal, a game designed for 60 FPS where the mobile PCs we've been looking at recently struggle. I was intrigued to see that this is a game where the Ally pushes ahead significantly of the Steam Deck in the 15-watt head-to-head. The Z1 Extreme delivers 15% more performance, rising to 52% in the turbo portable profile, rising again to 56% when plugged in. Frame rates are very poor at 1080p, but the gap widens still further. At 15 watts, the Ally is 20 points clear, rising to 48 and 51% once the turbo profiles are engaged. The benchmark does flatter to deceive though. Unfortunately, actual gameplay is an absolute stutterfest. I just can't recommend this game on any handheld PC at this point. Plague Tale Requiem next, which is a punishing game on Steam Deck requiring low settings and 720p resolution upscaled from 360p to get consistent gameplay. Now weirdly, I couldn't get VSync off tracking to work in our capture-based workflow, so I had to run this one on the deck with VSync enabled. So there will be a slight skew downward to the results, but perhaps not that much. Still, the Ally pulls ahead at a 14 percentage point lead, rising to 42 points in turbo handheld mode and 44% plugged in. And finally, a game that won't run on Steam Deck, not until hardware-accelerated ray tracing support is fully implemented. Since we can't compare against Steam Deck, I'm using the Neo Air Plus, a ridiculously small, powerful handheld using the Ryzen 7 6800U. I expected big wins for the ROG Ally here because, well, RDNA 3 handles ray tracing better than the RDNA 2 based 6800U, at least in theory. In this scripted scene from the beginning of the Tega level at 15 watts, there's only a 5 percentage point lead for the Ally up against the 6800U, but more intriguingly this rises to a more notable 16% when both handhelds are in their 25 watts configurations. A nice boost, but again I expected more when RDNA 3 is supposed to be more performant in RT than RDNA 2. And of course I expected more because we're comparing a brand new 4nm part up against an existing 6nm processor, which made me wonder how much of a leap the Z1 actually is against the 6800U generally, as there are a bunch of handhelds out there now using this processor. I've reviewed the ANEO 2 and ANEO Geek already and kinda love both of them actually, except that similar to what I'm seeing with the Ally, when you engage the top-tier performance profiles, it comes at the expense of a big hit to battery life, as we'll see. Still, let's return to A Plague Tale. A 15 percentage point lead for the Z1 up against the 6800U at 15 watts, and pretty much the same performance differential with both systems in their 25 watt modes. I also ran the same test in God of War, where the 6800U really struggles at 720p. The deck is about 23% faster than the 6800U. Test so shocking I reran it several times, but what this means is that the Ally's performance mode at 15 watts delivers a startling 39% lead. The gap between 6800U and Z1 Extreme drops to a more believable 18% at matching 25 watt levels. It's not plotted here, but I also tested at 1080p and there were similar differentials between the modes. Curious stuff. I also want to talk about the 9 watt silent mode because I touched on the issue earlier, but looking at actual data proves illuminating. Forza Horizon 5 again, 9 watts delivers proportionately lower performance than it should compared to 15 watts. So yeah, at 15 watts we're feeding 67% more power to the SoC compared to 9 watts, right? But we're getting a 2.3 times performance multiplier. 22.4 FPS in silent mode versus 52.3 in performance mode. Okay, so running AAA content at 9 watts isn't really a valid use case scenario, right? You want more horsepower. But running older games certainly is a valid use case scenario. And here's the classic Far Cry 2 benchmark. 720p, very high settings. So this is not good, because at 9 watts here up against Steam Deck, the lower specification Valve Handheld delivers 48% more performance at the same power level. Only by giving the Z1 Extreme a lot more power do we see results that actually make sense. So the Ally at 15 watts versus the Deck at 15 watts sees the Asus machine deliver 22% more performance overall, in line with many of our other 15 watt shootouts. So it really looks as though the Ally is kind of built around being a high power device with very obvious battery life considerations as a result of that. The alternative being something's really up with power management here. Seems that at lower power levels, Steam Deck is way ahead of the Ally. Still, there's certainly a lot to discuss when it comes to high power applications, right? And I do like to include a couple of handheld versus console snapshots in my reviews, so let's give that a shot with the Ally. The Plague Tale Requiem stacked up against PS5 here with the Ally on maximum wattage. Identical settings, all with 67% resolution scaling. In like-for-like testing at 2160p upscaled from 1440p, the Ally has 28.8% of the PS5's performance, while scaling back to 720p upscaled from around 480p shows the Ally delivering 91.7% of the PS5's standard output. Next up, a PS4 comparison. God of War, original settings 1080p. Data here is collected at all 3 usable presets, and our reference point is the original Gold Master code for the PS4 version. This is important as it runs with an unlocked frame rate. This is close to a like-for-like test with a PS4 game that matches the original console hardware, though Sony Santa Monica and Jetpack Interactive did need to re-architect some systems from scratch for the PC, like the particle system for example. In 15 watt performance mode, you're getting 86% of the PS4's frame rate, but moving up to the 25 watt portable turbo mode across the sequence, we move ahead of the PS4 with a 5.5 percentage point improvement. Go hell to leather with 30 watt turbo plugged in, and it's 9.7% ahead. It's worth putting those numbers into context though. That 9.7% means that the 35.2 FPS average is ahead of PS4's 32.0 FPS. Just a 3 FPS advantage then, but even so impressive. Still, I have been waiting for this moment because it's the first time a PC handheld has managed to literally beat the PS4 at its own game. The Deck could only match the PS4 at lower resolutions in performance terms, while the 6800U at 1080p was close but no cigar. Z1 Extreme finally moves ahead, but the power requirement to do so is onerous. So I guess we should talk about battery life. There's a 40 watt-hour battery in the Ally, just like the Steam Deck, so to cut to the chase here, if your handheld is consuming 40 watts, the battery will last for an hour, right? 20 watts, 2 hours. Similar to Steam Deck, it's going to be down to you to manage your settings, choose your games carefully, use frame rate limiters, and all the other stuff you'd be used to if you've ever played AAA games on a PC handheld. The system's performance overlay gives you consumption at any given point, so let's deal with a heavy-hitting game like God of War. A simple test here, just leaving the intro static and letting the battery run down. I tested on the Steam Deck, the ROG Ally and the Neo Air Plus, so a Van Gogh Z1 Extreme and a 6800U head-to-head, all at 15 watts. First of all, running unlocked, there's not much to tell the 3 units apart. 1 hour 21 minutes on Steam Deck, 1 hour 22 on the Ally, and 1 hour 19 on the Neo Air Plus. I expected more on the last one to be honest, because its battery has 15% more capacity. 46 watt hours versus the 40 watt hours on the Ally and Deck. Thing is though, that running flat out is not a great idea. So I retested with a 30 FPS frame rate cap, which should in theory give the Ally more of an advantage over the Deck, because its inherent performance advantage should mean that less power is required to maintain 30 FPS compared to the Valve machine, where GPU utilization will be higher. But check this out, capping frame rate increases battery life to 1 hour 41 minutes on the Ally, just 19 minutes longer. Capping frame rate on Steam Deck, 2 hours 16 minutes. This is not the result I expected. So with the Ally, maybe there are some Windows power management issues? Possibly, but our results looking at the Windows-driven Neo Air Plus don't offer any extra perspective. Battery life doesn't seem to improve at all here, likely because performance on the unit wasn't that much better than 30 FPS to begin with, meaning very little in the way of power savings when capping the frame rate. But battery life concerns are even more pressing if you decide to run the ROG Ally in its turbo portable mode, where power consumption absolutely hammers battery life. So look at what happens when we're running with frame rate unlocked, with the processor effectively running up maximum warp. I noticed that in just over 5 minutes of play I chewed through 10% of total system battery capacity. So yeah, about 50 minutes of play there, and that's shockingly poor really. In theory, the 25 watt mode should be adding 10 watts to the power consumption versus the 15 watt performance mode, but it's closer to 15, sometimes even 20 watts. So I'm a bit concerned by that, to be honest, because I don't really think it's good for the battery's longevity to be running a 40 watt hour cell with a 44 to 48 watt load. And essentially, to get the most out of the chip, you're effectively hobbling the device for its chosen purpose as a handheld gaming machine. 50 minutes of battery life just isn't good enough. Okay, so let's try to summarize and wrap this thing up. I've tested a few Windows-based handhelds so far, and I kind of love them, but it seems that anytime you want to acquire a portable PC that powers past the Steam Deck convincingly across the board, and not just in select titles, you need to ratchet up the power level, which in turn delivers a debilitating hit to battery life, and that's no exception with the Asus ROG Ally, unfortunately. Pretty convinced at this point that the Ally has power management issues that need to be looked at. Battery life with frame rate caps in place isn't where it should be, while performance on the silent 9 watt mode is disproportionately worse than it should be, with Steam Deck running rings around it at the same wattage. On the plus side though, this portable is leagues ahead of the competition in key regards when it comes to talking about the hardware. The form factor is smaller than the Steam Deck. It's easier to hold, in my opinion at least, and while the display isn't the OLED we all want it to be, it does have that crucial FreeSync feature, VRR, that we kind of want the Steam Deck to have, right? I've got to stress again how good the cooling system is. In performance and turbo portable modes, it's really difficult to fault. It's whisper quiet. This is a remarkable achievement, and I want to stress it's not just about the noise level of the fans, but the pitch of them. It's very, very easy to live with. Temperature management is good too. It's only on the mains turbo mode at 30 watts, where temperatures seem to hit the 95 Celsius limit that I suspect the processor has, and even then the fans do spin up to get those temperatures down, though success there depends a lot on different circumstances, like the nature of the load on the processor and ambient temperature, for example. But over and above the power management issues I have, there are some bad points. It does feel like the software needs a lot of work. The command center can be laggy, the frame rate limiter doesn't seem to do much in many games. There also seems to be more stutter in the gameplay experience than I would expect, coming from the Steam Deck and having experienced a few of those 6800U handhelds. Despite VRR, with that stuttering in effect, it can feel quite unstable. Perhaps more of an issue is the fact that Asus is so wedded to Windows as the platform here. And yeah, I can kind of get that, right? It's great for compatibility. It's great for getting more launchers than Steam alone working easily. And yes, it means that it's a good Game Pass machine. But the software experience is still a long, long way behind Steam Deck. The Asus Armoury crate is okay, but there's no real sense of integration with Windows. And I often found myself plugging in keyboard and mouse via a USB-C hub just to expedite the process of getting things done or getting things set up how I wanted them to be set up. But this is a first generation device, right? And it's very rare at all for any company to stick the landing perfectly with their first product. And there's so much that this thing does right. It's just a shame that the battery drain is so pronounced to get the best overall performance from the chip, and that the 4nm processor doesn't really deliver the efficiency enhancements I feel it should be. Bad battery life just isn't compatible with a decent gaming handheld, and ultimately what you get here is a good, if flawed, portable PC. But is it a good handheld? Man, that's a tricky question, and I'm not sure Asus has cracked it on its first attempt, and in this respect, Steam Deck is still leagues ahead. But if you're a PC enthusiast, a touch frustrated by the deck's performance limitations, this may well prove compelling as an alternative. But that's all from me for now, so please do like, subscribe, share if you enjoyed the content, and yeah, ring the bell for notifications, or no notifications if you have a phone like mine. But something that won't let you down is the DF Supporter Program. High quality video downloads, a brilliant, engaged, positive community, early access opportunities, weekly updates on our work, bonus material, and a ton of great stuff. Thanks for making it all the way to the end of this one, assuming that you did. And just generally, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.